Here we have lesson 36 entitled Slavery Divides the Nation. Now many of our teaks here we've seen before, so a few things that are new today. One, we're going to talk about the birth of the Republican Party, how it was created. That we will talk about the Compromise of 1850 along with some other acts of Congress and legislation that furthered sectionalism. That we can recognize the Union, Confederacy, and border states. That we understand how people and geography combine to affect historical events. We can analyze the impact of the Dred Scott v. Sandford case. So let's move forward. In Unit 7, we learned about the issues that caused the U.S.-Mexican War, one of which was the country's belief in manifest destiny to expand west to the Pacific Ocean. Well, prior to the war, in 1846, a congressman, David Wilmot from Pennsylvania, proposed the Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery in any territories acquired from the Mexican War. So they're already thinking ahead to adding new territories. However, Southerners said that this bill violated the Fifth Amendment right to property, saying, how can you take away somebody's property under the Fifth Amendment and ban slavery? So the Wilmot Proviso passed in the House, but it failed in the Senate. And why? Like we said, the Senate has balance between free and slave states, so that free and slave states could block each other's actions on slavery. But the Wilmot Proviso, while it did not become law, did deepen the sectionalism and distrust between the two regions. The next major act of Congress involving sectionalism and the spread of slavery was the Compromise of 1850. So how are we going to deal with the land that we've gained from Mexico? And also we talked about the expansion of California through the gold rush. So again, here's Henry Clay to the rescue as the great compromiser with an idea. First of all, the Compromise of 1850 was actually a series of laws that came together into one package. The first of these admitted California as a free state because, again, their population had grown so rapidly. It set a new border with Texas and New Mexico, which is the border today, and set up that kind of angle there between Texas and New Mexico. It banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and instead of banning slavery in the western territories, it said that popular sovereignty, meaning letting the people vote, would decide slavery in the Utah and New Mexico territories. And this idea of allowing slavery to expand through popular sovereignty would become a major issue during the 1850s. However, one part of the Compromise of 1850 was very controversial, and that was the Fugitive Slave Act. Like I said, this is part of the Compromise of 1850. In the previous unit, we talked about how many runaway slaves would escape to the north or into Canada, and were often even helped by abolitionists and people in the north. Well, the Fugitive Slave Act said that all Americans, especially American officials like police officers and military, would have to help in the capture of runaway slaves. It also set up a series of courts to decide whether a captured African American was a slave or a freed man. The judge was paid $10 to rule for the slaveholder, but only $5 if the slave was freed. So this naturally set up a bias toward ruling for the slaveholder. Slaves had no rights in these courts. They could not bring witnesses. They could not bring documents. They had to remain silent. So a consequence of the Fugitive Slave Act was that many freed blacks were captured and forced into slavery, and they had no way to protect their rights. Northerners hated this law, and many of them defied it by still helping runaways to escape. The debate over slavery was not just a political debate, but also a cultural one too. One of the most important events in this cultural debate was the writing of the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, written in 1852 by the abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe. In her novel, Stowe was attempting to portray what she considered to be a realistic portrayal of slave life. In fact, her novel was very melodramatic, somewhat over the top, and her characters were often exaggerated stereotypes. Some of the main characters included Uncle Tom, who was a kindly Christian slave, and Simon Legree, who was the evil slave overseer, and at the climax of the book, he has Tom whipped to death. Slavery in this book is portrayed as being cruel and immoral, and for some people even worse, unchristian. So Southerners called this false propaganda and considered this a very unfair portrayal of slavery and the South in general. In this passage from Uncle Tom's Cabin, we hear Tom pleading with Simon to not beat him, not for his own sake, as he says here, it will hurt you more than it will hurt me. Do your worst, my troubles will be over. But if you don't repent, yours won't ever end. So the idea that it will be Simon Legree who really suffers for this and not ultimately Tom. Another political compromise in the debate over sectionalism and slavery was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And this was proposed by Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who we'll hear from later on. And he proposed that the Nebraska Territory, which made up what was left of the Louisiana Purchase that had not already been incorporated, that this territory be split into Kansas and Nebraska. And just like we talked about with the Compromise of 1850, to let the slavery issue be decided by popular vote, by popular sovereignty of the territory's residents. And this would effectively repeal the Missouri Compromise, which had banned slavery in this region. This was opposed by many anti-slavery supporters, but this bill did pass in Congress. So what we have happening here is we're getting ready to have an election in Kansas about whether to allow slavery. So both sides, free and slave, send supporters pouring into Kansas. So to understand this better, let's take a quick look at a map. First of all, down here in the pink, we see this is the part of the country where slavery is legal. The green section here are the free states, and over here you see that in the west, California and the territory of Oregon are also free. The Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory have been allowed to vote on slavery by popular sovereignty under the Compromise of 1850. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is affecting this area here. This is what is left of the Louisiana Purchase if you take away the Indian Territory. This is what's left of the Louisiana Purchase. So what they decided to do is that we're going to allow the residents of this area to vote on whether they want to allow slavery or not. So the concern for people who oppose slavery was that should these bills pass, that the majority of the country, especially this middle part here, would all allow slavery, and slavery would move well beyond the South where it currently exists. So in Kansas, the debate is going to move beyond the political arena and go into the streets with violence which results in bleeding Kansas. We mentioned that all these people are piling into Kansas to have this election about whether we're going to allow slavery or not by popular sovereignty. Well, the pro-slavery supporters cheat to win the election, but the anti-slavery supporters do not recognize their government and in fact set up their own anti-slave government in Lawrence, Kansas. Well, the pro-slavery mob attacks and burns down their capital city. To avenge this, one of the abolitionists named John Brown, and John Brown's he's a little extreme, probably to the point of being a little crazy, to tell you the truth. John Brown, in the middle of the night, kidnaps and captures 5 of the pro-slavery leaders, takes them out into a field, and murders them with swords to avenge the burning of Lawrence, Kansas. This is just one step and one act in a long protracted 3-year civil war in Kansas called Bleeding Kansas. And the violence in the streets of Kansas spilled over to become violence in Congress. One of the senators from the North, Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, denounced the Kansas-Nebraska Act in a speech, and in doing so, this speech, he described slavery in very harsh and very offensive terms. He compared slavery to prostitution, and the Southern senators who supported it, particularly one he called out, a Senator Butler from South Carolina, essentially calling them pimps and comparing the idea of slavery to rape. So his speech was very extreme and to the Southerners very offensive. In fact, one of the congressmen, Representative Preston Brooks, who was Butler's nephew, entered the Senate chamber one day and he found Sumner at his desk. He proceeded to strike him over the head with a metal-headed cane, and he beat him almost to the point of death when his cane finally broke. Most of the country saw this violence as horrible, and they were terrified by the very idea of a congressman almost beating a senator to death on the Senate floor. But to the South, they called Brooks a hero. In fact, many of them even sent him new canes. So again, we're seeing the debate here become more and more extreme and more violent as it goes forward. Many people blame the Democratic Party for bleeding Kansas, and this resulted in a split between the party North and South, with the South supporting slavery and the North supporting the idea of slavery only by popular sovereignty. So anti-slavery politicians were left without a party to support, and so they formed a new one, the Republican Party. So here we have the birth of the modern Republican Party in 1854. The Republican Party opposed the spread of slavery. They were not calling for abolition at this point, simply that slavery not spread west into the new territories. The Republican Party ran their first presidential candidate in 1856. Speaking of the presidency, during this time of sectionalism, we see 4 presidents who were weak, one-term compromise candidates who were not very effective at controlling the growth of sectionalism in Congress. They were Zachary Taylor, who was actually a former general in the U.S.-Mexican War. He was a Whig. who died in office and was succeeded by his vice president, Millard Fillmore, also a Whig. So these two guys were not very supportive of the spread of slavery. The next two, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, were both Democrats, so they were more accepting of the spread of slavery and the continuation of slavery. But again, none of these guys was very effective at getting the country to turn back from the brink. Next, we have the story of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was an African-American slave who was purchased by a doctor in Missouri, which was at the time a slave state. With his master, Dred Scott moved and lived in Illinois and Wisconsin, which were both free states. After his master died, Scott claimed that by living in free states that had banned slavery, this in fact made him a free man and ended his slavery. So he sued for his freedom in court. His case went through the appeals process and finally arrived at the U.S. Supreme Court. And here we have the case of Dred Scott v. Sandford in 1857. In the opinion written by the Chief Justice, Dred Scott case decided two things. The first thing was whether Scott even had the right to sue at all. And the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution does not apply to slaves, and since Scott was not a citizen, he had no right to sue. So right away they're saying he has no business even being here. But instead of stopping there, they went forward and said that this idea of banning slavery in the territories, as it happened during the Missouri Compromise and other laws, that this violated the Fifth Amendment right to property, and that therefore the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, nor any law that banned slavery anywhere in the United States. So for the South, this was a total victory, but the North was furious by this decision. The Dred Scott case and issues of slavery became a major point of debate in the Illinois election for Senate in 1858. The incumbent was Stephen Douglas, the senator who had proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and his opponent was a young Republican congressman named Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln and Douglas went all over Illinois debating issues of Dred Scott and slavery. Now, while Douglas won the election, Lincoln became very famous and very well respected for his anti-slavery views and his anti-slave speeches throughout the country. Another important event in the growing sectionalism in the U.S. occurred at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. John Brown, who we've already mentioned, he was the violent abolitionist extremist who killed 5 people in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. John Brown believed that he had been called by God to lead a slave revolt, an armed slave revolt, in fact, to put an end to slavery in the U.S. So on October 16, 1859, to support this revolt, he and his sons and supporters raided a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in order to gather weapons to lead this armed slave rebellion. But when he called for help from slaves, none of them came to join him, and he was captured by federal soldiers, and most of his sons were killed. Brown was put on trial for murder and for treason, and he was hanged for those crimes, but he became a hero and a martyr to the abolitionist cause. So in the presidential election of 1860, we had 4 candidates. One was Abraham Lincoln, who is the Republican who opposes the spread of slavery. Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat who wants popular sovereignty to decide. John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat who is all in favor of slavery. And then John Bell, the Constitutional Union candidate, who simply wants to preserve the Union at any cost. Now in this election, you see that Lincoln wins the North and the Western states that oppose slavery. Breckinridge wins the slaveholding South, with the other 2 candidates splitting what become known as the border states here in the middle. So Lincoln wins the election pretty decisively by a large electoral vote. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, the southern states are convinced that it's only a matter of time before the rest of the country votes to ban slavery and end the southern way of life. So in December 1860, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede, which means to leave the Union, and by April 1861 they are joined by 10 others to form the Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy. When he's inaugurated, Lincoln asked them to not secede, but by this time the die is cast and the decision has been made. So here we show a map of the United States during the Civil War. The blue states are those that remained with the Union. The gray states are the Confederate states, the 11 states there. And these green ones here are called the border states because they still allowed slavery, but they chose to stay with the Union rather than to secede with the Confederacy. So our Lesson 36 thoughts. After all the events we've talked about, the changes, do you believe that the Civil War was inevitable or could have been avoided? So think about that. What do you think was the critical point of no return that led to the war? So explain and defend your choices, and we'll continue with the Civil War in the next lesson, North and South.